Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Hannah, and I'm the Secretary of the Tolkien Society. The Society are really delighted to have the opportunity to discuss Tolkien in the 21st century with Professor Nick Groom for the US launch of the book. So the plan today is to spend around 45 minutes where I'll interview Nick, and then there'll be an opportunity at the end for the audience to ask any questions that they have. So I'll give a little short introduction for anyone who doesn't know. Nick Groom is currently a professor of English literature at the University of Macau in China. He was previously professor in English at the University of Exeter, and he's held professorships at the University of Chicago and at Stanford. He has written or edited over 20 books and more than 60 academic publications. So, Nick, thank you so much for joining us at what I understand is quite an antisocial hour where you are.
Yes, it is right. It's a real pleasure to be here and very nice to see you again, Hannah. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Yes, you too. So, let's get started then. Your book covers a lot of ground. So, by way of introduction, can you give us a kind of brief overview of what you cover in this volume?
Yeah, certainly. So this is 21st Century Tolkien, or Tolkien in the 21st Century, as the American publisher has titled the book. It really attempts to explain why, after 50 years after his death, which of course just the anniversary of which was just a few days ago, Tolkien is still strikingly relevant to us today. And it's not just a book about the Hobbits and the Lord of the Rings and those particular texts, but I'm also very interested in the adaptations that have really created a Tolkien phenomenon. I pay particular attention to the radio adaptations, Brian Sibler's wonderful adaptation, for example, for the BBC in 1981, and also to the Peter Jackson films that have really turned Tolkien into not just a writer, but a whole range of cultural experiences and possibilities for different sorts of audiences using different platforms and all around the globe. So it'd be really nice in some ways, obviously I teach English literature, to say things, for example, like, well, you ought to read the books before you watch the films. But the films have been out for 20 years. They've become part of mainstream culture, and sadly, you can't really legislate like that. So I'm really trying to accept that and encourage others to do so. That we can't go back to a golden age where you read the books first in some sort of pristine purity, and then you watch the movies. It's just not like that anymore. So I think we have to accept that people will come to Tolkien through many, many different routes, and we have to respect that. And obviously, while I would like people to read the books, particularly after reading my own book, I know that a lot of fans, a lot of people I talk to, love the films and the other adaptations, but haven't quite got around to reading the books yet. That sounds acceptable. At the same time, I'm interested in tracing how the subtleties and the complexities of the books, which I think are very often overlooked, are carried through in some very interesting ways in the various adaptations, and really achieve a certain recognizable representation of Middle Earth that remains significant to this day.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I think let's stick with the topic of adaptations then and start with the latest one, the most relevant. So when you wrote the first edition of your book, Amazon's Rings of Power TV series was on the horizon, but it hadn't hit our screens yet. But I understand in this edition you've had a chance to add an afterward and talk a little bit about the series.
That's absolutely right. So just to try to explain to those people who are watching, this book exists in 4 different versions already. So the first hardback edition was published on the day that the Amazon Prime video series was actually first broadcast. So obviously I didn't have a chance to comment on it, except through the trailers and through various interviews and so forth. So I do talk about it in anticipation. Subsequent to that, there was an audio book, unabridged audio book. And then for the second UK paperback and for the American hardback, both of which are published round about now, I was given the opportunity to write an afterword discussing the first Rings of Power season, which I do. And if you haven't seen it, I shall try to avoid any spoilers, but it might be rather difficult, particularly in the Q&A. Now, I have come in for a certain amount of flack in podcasts for talking positively about this season. What I will say is give it a chance. We're only 1 season into what could be lasting for some years, so we have little to go on. But I've also had the interesting experience of having my daughter watch the whole of the Rings of Power season. She's a great Tolkien fan. She's read the books and then watched the movies, the Peter Jackson movies, and she found Rings of Power fascinating, as well as having friends who perhaps read the book many years ago, perhaps watched the films when they came out. They've also been watching the Rings of Power and also find it interesting. So I know that many Tolkien purists will be objecting to the Rings of Power for various reasons. I understand those objections, but I think we also have to give it a chance. And I hope I don't get too much flack against for saying that. But whether we like it or not, it is part of this developing Tolkien phenomenon. And there will be people in the future who have watched the Rings of Power and then watched the Peter Jackson movies and then may well read the books. So let's say we really do have to accept that and respect these different platforms.
Absolutely, and anything that brings in a new audience and hopefully eventually leads them to the books is something that we should all be really thankful for. I'd like to stick with adaptations for a little bit longer. So in my opinion, one of the most entertaining sections in your book is your discussion of the bizarre but quite infamous Boorman screenplay. So how do you think that would have been received had the movie ever been made, and would it have changed the landscape of Tolkien adaptations?
That's a really good question. And I mean, I must say that I've got a particular interest in John Boorman for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. So really, just to put everyone in the picture, once the film rights had been secured, and that itself is a rather complicated story. There's for example, this very short animated version of The Hobbit that was broadcast for one night only in New York. And well, the rights are being negotiated. I won't get into that story now. But United Artists certainly wanted to have an experimental film maker, an experimental director, leading on the Tolkien franchise to make a version of The Lord of the Rings originally. And John Boorman had already scored various hits and was fascinated by the book. And so he locked himself away with Rosso Pallenberg, a young scriptwriter, in a cottage in Ireland, where they actually sort of basically lived inside the book. They got copies of The Lord of the Rings and tore the pages out and then papered the walls and ceiling with the text. So they were sort of surrounded by these words, and they worked on their treatment for some time, and also apparently corresponded with Tolkien, and Tolkien was very pleased that this was not going to be an animated version. Originally, Tolkien was going to be appear himself in a framing device before we then had a sort of like a pan, as we do with the Jackson films across Middle Earth. But this was going to be a very distinctive version. Okay, first of all, it was going to be an adult film. So they were going to be originally planned to have some much more explicit scenes of sexual relationships, for example. It was also a movie where they decided to make a number of radical changes, such as getting rid of any flying creatures because they were too tricky to actually film, and because it was going to be a one film treatment, obviously there were going to be significant cuts. Now, one of the things that comes out from the treatment, and yes, the treatment, various people have discussed it and unfortunately ridiculed it. When you read the full script, it has an energy, it has a pace, it has a momentum. It would have been very different from the Ralph Bakshi version, which comes out at the end of the 70s, and obviously from the Peter Jackson films, because they have the luxury of being a 3-film treatment. But it has a very distinctive quality to it. It has a very noticeable magical, supernatural element. And it seems to me to be more, in many occasions, more like folk horror. It's very much in the tradition of movies like The Wicker Man, for example. Well, I say the tradition of that film hasn't actually been made yet, but it's using those references to folklore and to customs. For example, there's this in the siege of Minas Tirith. There's one moment where the actual beekeepers come out with their sort of bees covering their fists to come and fight against Sauron's forces. It's a very, very strange image. Also, Saruman becomes this figure who is appearing at all sorts of strange moments in this. I mean, there's no real Isengard scene, but he encounters Merry and Pippin in Fangorn, for example. He then turns up as the mouth of Sauron, which is quite an ingenious way of combining the various roles. And then he survives at the end and is some sort of con artist or shyster. Who really demonstrates that although the ring has been destroyed, that there's still a lot of uncertainty and sort of eeriness in the world. It's also a film that I think it ends in a particularly interesting way, when various characters seem to be left behind. For example, Aragorn and Arwen. Their affairs of state seem to overshadow their relationship with the members of the company. Obviously, hobbits such as Sam return to the Shire, but the two that we're left with at the end are Legolas and Gimli, who just stand on the shore near the Grey Havens, in this sort of edge space, and saying, well, we're not on the land or on the sea, but being on the edge is as good a place to be as any. So it's quite touching. Now, Boorman tried for years to get funding for this, never succeeded. And eventually the next film he made was a movie called Excalibur, because he's also fascinated by the Arthurian cycle. And I think in Excalibur you get a sense of what his version of Lord of the Rings might have been like. So visually very, very stunning. It's what I call romantic realism. You've got these fantastic suits of armor, but you also got actors who are really, really fighting each other. The actors on Excalibur realized very soon that they could actually hit each other, and the armor was strong enough to protect them. And then the armorer, Terry English, would then knock the dents out every evening, and they could start again the next day. So it's got a very sort of visceral quality, much as the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies have. It has a sort of very material palpability to it. And I think that watching Excalibur, which I think is one of the great fantasy movies of the 1970s or 80s, it gives you a sense of what Boorman's Lord of the Rings might have looked like. And I don't think it would have been a disappointment, but it would have been very idiosyncratic. And I don't think it would have really diverted Peter Jackson too much when he managed to get his 3-film sort of agreement with his backers to make it. On the other hand, it would have made Peter Jackson's films paced differently, because Peter Jackson takes so much, as we know, from the Ralph Bakshi movies, particularly
Yes, he does. Yeah.
The cutting between scenes, making various decisions, not only in styling, but in some of the most iconic scenes of his movies. So he'd have had to have worked harder in terms of actually working out the particular sort of narrative drive of his films. So I think he may have relied more on the BBC radio version by Brian Sibley than. But who knows? We don't have the Boorman. We don't have the Boorman images, so maybe Boorman would have fed into the Peter Jackson films.
Very true. And I think it is a fascinating screenplay and well worth a read. And as Boorman himself said, it carried the spirit rather than the letter of the book, but it is very interesting.
I think that's very well said. I mean, any form of adaptation, it can't be completely accurate in terms of adapting, particularly literary text. But Boorman thought sort of long and hard about what he thought the themes were and tried to condense those down into a single film version. And yes, it would have been different. It would have had some very, I mean, for example, there's a dance in Rivendell that's supposed to represent the history of the ring, and sort of Sauron is partly based on Mick Jagger.
It is interesting how he, does distill out these themes. And we do know that in Tolkien's writings, there are so many recurring themes like death and immortality, hope and despair, fate and free will. And at the beginning of your book, you have more of a critical analysis of some of Tolkien's writings, and you focus in on uncertainty, the ambiguity of evil, and hesitancy of good. Why do you think these themes in particular are relevant to the 21st century?
Yes, well, I think it's partly because the book it's for me, it's changed a lot since I first read it many years ago, when it appears to be a book of the triumph of good over evil, and it's a very elaborate and sophisticated tale. But certainly the first few times I read it, I was sort of became immersed in the in that sort of world, and really some of the ambiguities and contradictions and complexities passed me by at that young age. But then when I had the opportunity to teach the book, and that took a while before I was, in a sense, sort of allowed to do so. I mean, I'm sure that many of your viewers will realise that this book is very, very neglected at university level in particular, and really needs to be taught on many more courses. And I realised really what a dark book it is, but how many of those definitions, for example, of good and morality and attitudes towards value are very uncertain in the book, and that there are very few stable points. And I got very interested in how it is really a book that contains many loose ends, many ambiguities, many inexplicable issues, and indeed characters, many problems, and that's its real strength. Your viewers may know what Tolkien says about fairy stories and secondary creation, and the role of the artist in trying to create this sort of secondary world. Now, many readers, I think, particularly readers, assume that this means creating a completely consistent, internally sort of working fantasy world, which everything sort of fits together like a beautiful watch. But Middle Earth is not like that, because our own world isn't like that. There are all sorts of things that don't make sense, and things that we can't really understand from our own perspectives, from our own world views. And Tolkien, I think, very brilliantly encompasses all this, and he doesn't feel the need to explain everything. And it's those problems, and let's say particularly the loose ends, the things that don't add up, that they're the things that make it real, and draw us in as readers, even though we might not realize it. And that, to me, began to get more and more pressing as a 21st century issue. It added a level of complexity to the book that really seemed to be speaking to the sorts of issues we're facing today. Now, I say that this is not a lockdown book. It's not like I was sort of given several months or even years during lockdown to write it, but it does bear, I think, the impression of our experience of the past few years of isolation, alienation, even loneliness, but also the uncertainty of what the future held, and also the re-enchantment, perhaps, of everyday life, when very simple things became imbued with fresh meaning, because we couldn't meet our friends, we couldn't go out in the ways in which we had to take all sorts of precautions, for example. So it became much more alive to what had been everyday life before. And so I say, I don't think that it is this book, I didn't write it as a lockdown book, but I think it does bear the impression of the lockdown experience. And through that experience for many people in different ways across the world, I think it's a way in which the book becomes much more relevant. Now, of course, Tolkien had no idea that there's going to be a pandemic, and I'm not suggesting anything like that. He had no idea of the technological and social changes that we've experienced since his death. But works of great literature are able to adapt. We're able to read them in different ways. We approach them from fresh perspectives. And The Lord of the Rings in particular is a book that can welcome those new interpretations and give them back to us in ways that can, I think, enhance and enrich our lives. And I do keep returning to the book for those sorts of reasons, not because I've got the answer to these problems, but because simply living with those problems, those uncertainties, those doubts, those ambiguities, is what makes the book a companion, really, through one's reading life. And some of those things are carried over into the adaptations. I think that's one of the reasons why they can be significant. So I'll just give you sort of a couple of examples. Very small example: as the hobbits are leaving the Shire, they're spotted by a fox, and the fox thinks, "What are these hobbits doing out at this time of night?" And Tolkien just says, "And the fox never found out." So we have this sentient fox who's noticing things, but doesn't find out where the hobbits are going. He's obviously, the fox is untouched by the ring. We never have these that sort of level of sentience in mammals elsewhere in the book. And so it's one of those strange loose ends that sort of Tolkien just hints that there's way more to Middle Earth than just the story of the ring and the free peoples and so forth. A similar example would be when Gandalf and the Balrog go down below Moria. There are passages beneath what the dwarves delved. So what are they doing? Where are those? What do those catacombs mean? Who created them? We don't know. We never do know. A bigger, more controversial example, of course, would be Tom Bombadil, a character who Tolkien refused to explain, didn't really know himself. He claimed, he admitted. But Bombadil does not fit. And yet, it's not just the episode when he rescues them from the Old Forest, the fact that the ring doesn't have any effect on him. He also rescues them from the Barrow Wight. He's mentioned in Rivendell. And then, of course, Gandalf goes to spend time with Bombadil rather than go into the Shire with the hobbits at the end. So Bombadil is one of those, inexplicable characters, doesn't quite fit in the world, but he's suggesting there are other possibilities, there are sort of other realms, if you like, other influences, other powers that aren't part of this story, but might be part of a different story. So I think that works really well for me. I think I know Bombadil in particular is what we call a Marmite character. Some people love him, and others who are watching, I'm sure, despair at Bombadil. But I think that it's important that he is not explained, and that's really the significance. Now, of course, Bombadil doesn't appear in the Peter Jackson movies. He's nearly always cut from adaptations. But one of the things that the Peter Jackson movies succeeded in doing was introducing a level of uncertainty and doubt by having so many different takes of each scene. So the actors didn't really know how their characters were developing, where they were going, which particular take would be used. So in that sense, the film was made in the editing suite, and so the characters, the actors, are exploring the world in the same way that we explore the world as readers, because we don't know what's going to happen. And that's because the characters don't know what's going to happen. And that's because, as for example, Tom Shippey has pointed out, Tolkien didn't know what was happening. Anybody who reads the history of Middle-earth will know that Tolkien wrote without a plan, or rather, he had lots of plans, none of which he really saw through. So he was exploring the world himself. He starts off with the first chapter very explicitly modelled on the Hobbit, and then the Black Riders appear. And in a letter he says, I don't know what these Black Riders are, or where they've come from, or what they're doing. So he was, as he put it, discovering the story. He doesn't sit down with a detailed plan and write it out. He's feeling his way through it, and that's what a writer such as Terry Pratchett. That's one of the reasons why he loved it when he first read it. He felt that we're all exploring, we're all learning about discovering this world together, and you do feel that you are within the story in that sense. And Tolkien was aware of that. I mean, Sam talks about being inside a song at a couple of occasions. So it's that sense of your relationship to the narrative isn't one of, if you like, superiority or having power over the story. It's about the story having power over you. And that's one of the most distinctive aspects, I think, of Tolkien's work, and that's one of the ways in which all of us can get lost in it. And as I say, I think Peter Jackson went some way towards achieving that in his adaptations.
That's brilliant. That's so interesting, the way you tie Tolkien's uncertainty while writing down to the reader's experience, and then straight through to the actors on the Jackson films. That's really interesting. Thank you.
I think that's. I mean, I think it's important to see Peter Jackson's work as being in a tradition of adaptation. And we mentioned the Ralph Bakshi movie earlier. I remember going to see that when I was. I would have been 13, so I'd read the book a couple of times. It was released in the UK in 1979, I think, and being bitterly disappointed by it. On the other hand, one of the friends I went to see it with, I'm still in touch with, we had an argument about it just the other day, because he thinks it's far superior to the Peter Jackson versions because of various sinister qualities. But however you feel about the Bakshi version, you can't deny the influence that it has on Peter Jackson, particularly in the phrasing of the hobbits leaving the Shire and Gandalf and Saruman's duel, and iconic scenes such as the hobbits under the roots of the trees when the Black Rider is on the road are lifted straight from the Bakshi version. Small details such as Saruman having long fingernails, even little things like that. And the Hobbit's feet, which is one of my bugbears, I guess. Tolkien talks about the feet being sort of thickly furred with curling hair. But the influence of Bakshi and on the Jackson movies meant that the Hobbit's feet are now imagined and pictured to be large and only sort of sparsely haired. So they are quite different. And those sorts of elements are carried over into the Rings of Power, which I think quite deliberately uses much of the same visual imagery and references that Peter Jackson's films do.
That's very true. You mentioned earlier about teaching Lord of the Rings at a university level, and I understand that you were the first person in the UK to teach Tolkien at university.
And not the first, because I'm pretty
One
sure
of
there
the
was.
first.
Well, I learned that there was a course at the University of Lincoln, but I certainly did struggle to teach it in terms of struggle to get permission to do so. So
Why
when
do
I
you
was,
think it is such a struggle to teach Lord of the Rings at that level?
well, one of the reasons was I was lucky enough to go to Oxford when I was an undergraduate, and there were still plenty of people there who remembered Tolkien, and of course Tolkien and Lewis had revised the English syllabus there, much to the annoyance of various other people. So there were certainly things like compulsory Anglo-Saxon for undergraduates. And in fact, I was taught, among others, by Valentine Cunningham, who famously appears on the BBC documentary in the 1960s about Tolkien in Oxford. And he criticizes Tolkien for things like class politics and so forth. So people like that were still very much around. And Oxford just ignored Tolkien at that point. And I think I've told you this story before, that I walked past the Oxfam shop on St. Giles, and there were actually Tolkien letters in the window. They were selling letters written by Tolkien. I was an impoverished student. I couldn't afford to buy them. I mean, obviously, I should have done it, but I've realised how much they would have been worth today. I should have sold all of my other books to get them. But there were no Tolkien walking tours. There was no sort of Tolkien bookshelf in Blackwell's, for example. And certainly, the idea of studying Tolkien was absolutely no. And that became the case when I first started teaching. Eventually, I got to the level where I thought, well, I'm a senior member of staff. Surely I should be able to have some say in what I teach now. So just as an experiment, tried just doing a couple of weeks on Tolkien. In fact, it's a suggestion of a colleague at the University of Bristol. And it worked really well. And I remember rereading the book at that point and thinking, yes, there is enough here. Because it's always a risk, a book that one's very fond of, to take it into a seminar room and have it potentially torn apart by sort of voracious undergraduates. But I realised that that the book could certainly withstand sort of penetrating critique. So I developed then a whole course, which really served as an introduction to Anglo-Saxon and medieval literature through the lens of Tolkien. And then covered the books in detail. And then I began to realize that more and more students had seen the films first, which is where we started this conversation. And they'd seen the movies, but they hadn't yet read the book and were going to read the book during the course of the program. And that's the course I'm now teaching here in Macau. So in East Asia, Tolkien has the same sort of purchase on the imagination. It's got the same level of enthusiasm. And I've got some very good undergraduates who know the history of Middle-earth backwards and sort of eagerly read every new publication. So it is a global phenomenon now in that respect. The course, as I currently run it, does take in the films in much more detail than I did a few years ago. And of course, we're now moving into Rings of Power territory as well. But it demonstrates the topicality of Tolkien, and he has this. His works have this great sort of malleability. They can be reshaped, reforged, reworked, and that's the process we're going to be going through in the next few years, not just with the Rings of Power, but also with the War of the Rohirrim, for example, that is due to be released next year, and there are other movies slated. So this is an expanding universe, and I think it's a very exciting one to be privileged to be part of.
Absolutely. I want to change direction a little bit now, and think about Tolkien's language. So I'm pretty sure all of our listeners will know that Tolkien was a world-class philologist, and in the Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, he uses a lot of ancient and archaic words, and he revives obsolete meanings of words, and likes to favor, Gothic origin words rather than Latin. How do you think this kind of language holds up for the modern reader?
Well, I think it's the first thing to say about it is that it's ludic, it's playful, and Tolkien, he's a great researcher, an expert into language and philology, the origins of words, the ways they've been used. He'd have been, people say Tolkien, wouldn't have enjoyed the sort of the information age, but he would have loved the way that you can now search for particular words in databases of medieval languages, not just English and so forth. I mean, he would have been thrilled by that particular possibility. I mean, it's remarkable in a book such as A Hobbit. Before the story begins, we've already got the maps, and indeed sort of Tolkien designed the cover if you get a particular version, and the title page. But then you get a strange philological note about the plural of dwarfs being dwarves. You think this is the most odd way to begin a children's book. This is. And then you get words such as confusticate, which are, Tolkien's sort of playful neologisms. He's introducing these little elements into there because he wants to tease and entertain a child with a love of words and language. So I think that there is that very playful quality to it. And then, of course, in the Lord of the Rings, there's a whole sort of lexicon, if you like, of strange usages, such as the weapon take of the Rohirrim, which is based on an Old Norse word, but not for taking up weapons, for actually organizing sort of territory and governance. And then you get, Eowyn calling the Lord of the Nazgul, foul Dwimmerlake, which is based on an earlier medieval word, Dweomer, but it doesn't appear in the Oxford English Dictionary as Dwemer. But we know that she's saying something terrible to the Lord of the Nazgul. We're in the presence of meaning, but we can't quite grasp it ourselves. And so again, that's that level of uncertainty and hesitancy that there aren't quite words to describe the horror that she's facing. So I think that you get instances such as that. But of course, Tolkien claimed that the Lord of the Rings was a work of philology, that he'd invented these languages, and he needed to have a context for them. And in fact, I met a gentleman when I was giving a talk back in the UK over the summer, who'd actually met Tolkien. This gentleman had been an undergraduate in the 1950s, had read Lord of the Rings, and him and a friend went and had tea with Tolkien. And this was one of the things he said that Tolkien said. He said, "No, it's a book of philology." And Tolkien says the same things in his letters. I mean, I think Tolkien just enjoyed, teasing people. He's got a very mischievous sense of humor. It does have philology in the book. It's got an invented philology, in the same way that it's a fabricated history. And we do get the appendices with the details of languages and alphabets. But there's very little Elvish, for example, in the book. And what there is isn't, it's barely translated. So Tolkien's got the languages there, not at the forefront of the story, but to create this impression of deep history, which is what he talks about Beowulf as having. So there's, when you're reading it, there's a sort of confidence that these aren't just random words that have been selected to sort of spice up the story, but there's actually a bedrock, there's a foundation of sort of linguistic integrity to this work. And even though we only glimpse it, it is there, and it does support the references to the language that's actually made. And we accept it, we go along with it. For example, at the Gates of Moria, which all hinges on the use of a particular Elvish word. But we don't have characters really discussing things in Elvish, as we do in the films. It's interesting in the movies that Peter Jackson wants to make a point of that by having subtitles to show us that this is another language. We only glimpse it in Tolkien. In the same way, we only really glimpse the elves. I mean, there's very little sort of elvish activity. We have Gildor, we have Rivendell. Legolas doesn't say very much for the first part of the book, and then of course we have Lothlorien. But it's a book that's focused on other species, primarily, of course, the hobbits and the humans. So the elves are there, and they have a really clear presence, and their language has a presence, but it is in the background and more than partially obscured, I think. So I would say, yes, it is a book that contains elements of philology, but I think Tolkien was laying a false trail by suggesting that you had to become an expert in languages to make sense. In the same way that the riddles in The Hobbit, he makes different claims. At one point, he says that every one of them has a source from a variety of sources, whether it's from ancient Greek, from Anglo-Saxon or medieval, or just from nursery rhymes. At another point, he says that he made up some of them. So he's really, I think, teasing scholars. And those that we have identified possible sources for are often only loosely based on them. So it's the activity of the imagination and the presentation which is interesting here, not necessarily nailing down a particular source.
Absolutely. We are coming closer to the end of our time already, which I can't believe. So I want to wrap up with one more question, and then I'll invite any of our participants who want to ask you anything to just raise their hand, and I should be able to let them talk. So to round up, do you think that Tolkien's writing will still be relevant in the 22nd century?
Wow. I think certainly for the next 30 years, I think there is definitely a momentum. We've got at least 3 classic movies. The Lord of the Rings movies. I know that the Hobbit films are more controversial, but let's not forget that they did comparably well at the box office, and it's certainly for viewers of my children's generation, they find them really, really exciting. But both of my daughters have read The Hobbit. The youngest one spent the summer watching the Hobbit movies, and then spent quite a lot of time quizzing me about them, and was astonished at how little I knew. Various details. They spend hours poring over the wonderful, Weta Workshop books explaining the development of Smaug, for example. So there are definitely new fans coming up, and I think that the expected forthcoming seasons of The Rings of Power, and as I say, the new movies will really sort of secure Tolkien at least for the next 30 years. Into the next century, who knows what platforms there will be. Certainly, gaming is a massive and developing area. And I think we're going to see much more immersive Tolkien computer games, for example. Certainly Peter Jackson was alive to that. And so the spin-off games, not really spin-offs anymore. I mean, they're a world of their own, have extra material and contributions from the actors in his movies. So I think that will be one direction in which the Tolkien phenomenon will develop. And there will, of course, be new publications from the Tolkien archives. I've got no doubt about that. So yes, depending on what happens sort of globally, and of course I'm no prophet for that, but I think the resilience of Tolkien's writing and also the adaptations in the face of something like the pandemic shows that the books have this extraordinary potential to keep teaching us things. Another area would be environmentalism. That Tolkien's not just a tree hugger. People say, oh, Tolkien loves trees. He's very concerned about the natural world and about ecology. And there are famous photographs of him with his favorite trees. Yes, that's certainly true. But he also knew that nature, in Tennyson's words, was red in tooth and claw, and that included trees. The whole anti-quest of the ring very quickly nearly comes to grief in the Old Forest with Old Man Willow. And of course, Treebeard himself was at one point conceived to be an evil character. Tolkien's aware. I mean, rather like a writer such as, or an artist such as William Blake, and I think there are lots of affinities with William Blake, is that Tolkien's looking at a world where there are many different perspectives. The human perspective is not the sole perspective. We get the point of view from hobbits, we get the point of view from dwarves, we get the point of view from elves. For example, Legolas and Gimli can't really communicate they can't exchange, they can't share the love of trees with the love of rock because they've got different languages, they've got different perceptions, they have different conceptions of that. You also get the view from the trees, you get Treebeard's view. But all of these perspectives are flawed. Treebeard, for example, hasn't heard of hobbits. So, although we think that he's a very wise character, knows a great deal, the fact that he is not aware of the existence of hobbits should give us cause for some concern, I think. So Tolkien's very respectful towards not having that great sort of dogmatic overview from one perspective. And I think that in that sense, it's teaching us to understand other ways of seeing the world, and also how we might usefully coexist with these other perspectives, with, as Blake would say, both the lamb and the tiger, or as Tolkien might put it, with both hobbits and trees.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nick. It's been a real pleasure. So we've still got a few minutes. So if any attendees have a question that they would really like to ask, if you pop it in the Q&A, I can read it out, or if you raise your hand, I can invite you to speak if you would like to ask your question in person. We have two in the Q&A, so I can get started with that and then see if anyone's brave enough to speak to us. So the first one that came through is, Professor Groom, have you seen any of the Russian adaptations of Tolkien's work, and maybe the animated Mr. Bliss short? If so, what are your thoughts?
I did watch the Russian film version, which is very strange. In fact, my book is being translated into Russian, so that sort of indicates that there is a level of interest there. And I actually do show the animated Mr. Bliss as part of my teaching when I'm looking at influence of children's books. I don't really discuss them in any detail. I think they're just mentioned in passing, much as the Finnish version is mentioned, because they haven't become part of the mainstream of Tolkien adaptations. I think they need to be recognised. They're certainly part of that spectrum, but at the moment they haven't really. They're more standalone productions that are interesting for the moment in which they were produced, but they haven't had a longer abiding influence. I think if we're thinking about Russian adaptations, I think Kirill Yeskov's book, The Last Ring Bearer, is well worth anybody reading. It's available free as a PDF online. I was introduced to it by a delegate at a Tolkien conference probably over 10 years ago, I think now. And it's the Return of the King written from the perspective of the orcs. So it opens up a whole fascinating way, I think, of rethinking some of Tolkien's concerns. That's I think that there is, I mean, whether I'm the person to write it, I don't know, but I think that there are books to be written about, global Tolkien in terms of the significance that he has in places such as Russia. So I look forward to other people taking up that challenge.
Absolutely. So another one of our listeners would be very interested in hearing you expand a little more on your views of Tolkien and Blake. Is Tolkien a romantic?
Well, he certainly has romantic qualities to his work and composition, and there's a very good essay in Tolkien Studies about the influence of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Imagination on Tolkien's end theory, particularly when it comes to creativity and secondary creation. Now, Tolkien would have encountered Blake early on. Now, the person to ask about this is Will Sherwood, of course, who's done a lot of work on Tolkien and the Romantics.
And he is with us this evening, so if he wants to add any comments, then he can.
But I think that's really the strong connection with Blake is the combination of visual art with the calligraphic art, the book arts, if you like, and the presentation of the object of the book, the physical object is what I mean, as an important component. And so I do spend some time talking about, particularly the Lord of the Rings. I don't have my early copies here, but if you do get the chance to look at or buy one of the early hardbacks, the first, second, or third edition hardbacks, you can often pick them up on eBay. They've got these wonderful fold-out maps, for example, that we tend to lose that particular dimension when we read paperback versions. But you realise how much artistry went into creating the book. So Tolkien designed the dust jackets, he designed the spines, he designs the title pages. You have those Elvish runes, which are then adopted by the dwarves, and Tengwar script. You have a whole series of what are called paratexts. They're sort of parts of the book that aren't necessarily part of the story, but you have to negotiate before you get to the story. And then you have all the appendices afterwards, of course, and further maps. And so the story doesn't really end with the end of the narrative. There's a lot of extra material, and the index. Who reads every word of the index? I mean, I got a new index prepared by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull. So that's an aspect of the book that only, I think, the most diligent reader would actually read through it. It's a part of the book that's, of course, not written by Tolkien himself. So I think that the relationship with Romanticism is to do with that. It's like a visionary conception of book arts. And Blake's has a lot to say about how you make books. For example, in the Songs of Innocence, there's a lot about the actual status of the book. also in his account of printing presses and so forth. And I think that certainly fired Tolkien's imagination. I think more generally, there are lots of things like Tolkien's fascination with dreams. There's a lot of dreaming in the Lord of the Rings, and particularly among the hobbits, who there's this sort of sense of unreality about many of the episodes, and I think that's influenced by Romantic writers as well. So, I mean, I certainly think that there is a strong thread running from writers such as Coleridge and Blake through to Tolkien, but also from Keats, and I've recently written about Wordsworth and Tolkien actually coming out in one of Will Sherwood's collections shortly. So looking at conceptions of stone in Wordsworth and how those compare with Tolkien. So yes, I mean, I think there are strong affinities there, but I think Tolkien's got strong connections with other areas of literature as well.
Absolutely. And Tolkien was actually very modern, wasn't he, in including maps and an index and the prologues and all of these like quite experimental elements in his book at that time.
Amazingly so. I mean, this is one of the things that it's easy to overlook. You know, how many novels have appendices? How many novels have indexes or maps? Well, there are a few that have maps. You know, Treasure Island, for example, even The Wizard of Oz. Pilgrim's Progress would be another one. But to have so many of these elements in a single work is experimental, and he's an experimental writer. And yes, there are romantic elements, and romantic writers often have prefaces. For example, Coleridge's preface to Kubla Khan, where he says it was all a dream. Do we believe him? Which is sort of comparable to the prefaces that Tolkien has, you know, such as the foreword to the Lord of the Rings, when he gives a version of how he wrote it, and says that it's not an allegory. I have a cordial dislike of allegory. Well, don't take it at face value, because he wrote allegories. I mean, he couldn't have disliked them that much. He's got 2 allegories in his lecture on Beowulf, not to mention the allegory Tree and Leaf. Leaf by Niggle, which is in Tree and Leaf. This is an example of this sort of multifaceted Tolkien, I think, who does also have affinities with some modernist writers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick. That's us. It's already 9 o'clock here in the UK. So I think we'll wrap up by saying thank you once again. That's been such a pleasure to speak to you again and to talk about your book. It's been really excellent. So thank you for agreeing to do this.
Well, thank you so much for excellent questions, and for being patient with me, because I know that I tend to answer it at great length.
No, that's brilliant. I think we've all been hanging on your every word. It's been really fascinating.
Time has passed very quickly, so we must do it at some point. Thank you so much for the time.
Absolutely. Anytime. Oh, sorry, we have one quick, no, sorry, we had a hand raised, but it very quickly disappeared. So I will let everyone go, and thank you to our audience for joining us.
Take care, everybody. Namarie.
Namarie.